I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of Parallax Views, the third I've released today, we're going to be speaking with the Quincy Institute's Benjamin Freeman, returning guest, about a very, very important story. This may be the most important edition of the program I released this month, as we delve into the way Congress is moving in a very stealthy manner to integrate the U.S. and Israeli militaries through the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, specifically Section 224 of the 2027 NDAA. This is very important. It's going to have big ramifications if it goes through. So you're going to want to listen to this conversation with Benjamin Freeman. But before we get to that, I need to remind you that this show is listener funded. If you appreciate any of the work I do, please consider supporting me. It's the beginning of the month. Go on Patreon, patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you can, lend me your support. $1 helps, $5 even more, $10 or more gets you a producer's credit on the show. Okay, so please consider supporting me on patreon.com/parallaxviews so that I can keep covering topics like this and others. Now, in addition to that, I'd like to remind you that I have one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of WallStreetWindow.com, and I want you to check out his newsletter, WallStreetWindow.com. Sign up for it there. It's the best financial and trading newsletter around. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips, and he is a real straight shooter. No BS, no carny talk. He'll tell you what's up. So, please consider supporting Mike by signing up for his newsletter free of charge at WallStreetWindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to this conversation, folks. Benjamin Freeman of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We're talking about a very important issue here. Like I said, very important. U.S.-Israel military integration, Section 224 of the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act. Let's get to it. Welcome back to Parallax Views. One of my favorite guests, Benjamin Freeman, is director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute and author of The $1 Trillion War Machine: How Runaway Military Spending Drives America into Foreign Wars and Bankrupts Us at Home. And we're going to be talking about an article he wrote for Responsible Statecraft that's gone really viral, along with one of Steve Simon's briefings, another colleague of Ben's at the Quincy Institute. And the article is entitled, Congress Quietly Moves to Integrate U.S. and Israeli Militaries. First off, how are you doing, and what has it been like seeing this go viral?
Well, first, JG, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on Parallax Views with you. But yeah, to your question, it's been kind of a wild 4 days. We expected some people to pay attention, but we certainly didn't expect for folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ro Khanna, Thomas Massey. We had Ron Paul yesterday, kind of like read out an audio version of the book. No, when you write an article, you don't expect to have those kind of heavyweights, shouting it out. So it's been great.
I'll tell you something really funny. Okay, so I'm in a few different Discords, and I have other interests outside of foreign policy. So I'm in a movie Discord, and in the off-topic section, someone posted this article, and it wasn't me. So I was like, even in the movie Discords, it's getting out there.
That's great to hear, man. Yeah, it's coming up in all these weird places. It is good because we need everybody, like we say in the piece, we need people to contact their member of Congress. So this is one of those like few things where we can still stop. That's why we wrote the article. We can do something about this, but before it actually starts.
So let's get into it. This is about the House's version of the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, which was released last Tuesday, and there's a specific section, 224, entitled United States Israel Defense Technology Cooperation Initiative. What exactly is this? Take us through it.
Yeah, it's buried in the NDAA, and this is this 500-page bill, and so this is an opportunity for all kinds of folks to sneak all kinds of things into. It's the defense policy bill, and so what Section 224 would effectively do is it arguably do more to intertwine the U.S. military with the Israeli military than we've ever had before, and this is on top. We already have these deep military connections with Israel because the amount of aid we give to Israel. We've given Israel over $200 billion in military assistance over the years. So we've got these deep ties, and there's the Israel lobby in the U.S. There's already just enormous Israeli influence in the U.S. and in the U.S. military. What this would do is really take it to the next level. And what it specifically does, it calls for the defense military, what it says, defense military integration, which includes things like data fusion, literally quoting that word. There's data fusion, network integration. In other words, the U.S. military's data would be the Israeli military's data there. If you read that literally. It includes all of this other, co-production agreements, working together on autonomous systems, directed energy, cyber, you name, like every battlefield of the future. This proposal calls for the U.S. military. I mean, beyond just working hand in hand, but like working as one. So we're really concerned that this would tie us to Israel more than ever before.
Now, can you talk about, I guess, what's the current model that's being used for how Israel receives funding? It's through foreign military financing, which is through the State Department. That's voted on annually by Congress. This is very different.
Yeah. That's exactly right. The current model, it's done under what's known as an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, and that lays out how we give Israel nearly $4 billion a year in military assistance. Some of that comes back to, a huge chunk of that actually comes back to the U.S. Some of that goes, basically, we give Israel effectively money to buy stuff from our own defense contractors. And so, the argument the military industrial complex makes is like, no, we're not giving it away. It's good for business. It's sort of boomeranging back to us. Not all of it does that, but, a big part of it does that. And we've been doing this since Israel was founded in 1948. We've had some level of military assistance to them, but yeah, the current model is just under $4 billion. And that the key to that model is you get some congressional oversight of it. You get, if Israel acts up, members of Congress can say, they can introduce legislation to say, hey, we're going to pull the plug on some of this military assistance, or if not all of it, we're going to cut part of it. And so it at least provides some accountability, some transparency, some way to hold Israel accountable for its destabilizing actions in the Middle East. With this new model that they're talking about, this military industrial complex integration model, most of that just goes out the window because then all of the cooperation then is outside of Congress. It would happen within the Department of Defense. This would create a position in the Department of Defense whose job is literally to promote direct U.S. to Israeli military cooperation on all those different measures that I mentioned before. So you'd effectively have, you'd have a fox in the hen house. You'd have an Israeli advocate, literally working at the Pentagon, pushing this cooperation initiative with Israel. The public would have very little to no oversight of it because it's happening in this giant Pentagon bureaucracy, and the Pentagon still hasn't ever passed an audit. So, it already can't keep track of its own money, let alone Israel's money. So you would see a level of transparency here that would just go away, but fundamentally different than the aid model.
Now, also, you point this out in the article. Yes, we have relationships with NATO partners on co-production and shared supply chains, right? But this is a completely different beast. Why is this different than maybe our relationship with NATO partners?
Yeah, a lot of NATO partners, and it's not just NATO too. We have agreements that, on at least on paper, they look somewhat like this. With India, for example, we have agreements with Australia. The AUKUS, the so-called AUKUS, Australia and the United Kingdom. We have all these other deals out there. In NATO, especially, NATO has some very serious, mutual defense commitments, the so-called Article 5 commitments, where, if one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked, and we'll join the fight if somebody gets attacked. That's not what this is. That's a separate thing. That is a very serious thing. But what's different in this is the level of military industrial integration. None of those other provisions that I mentioned had, whether it's AUKUS, whether it's NATO, any of those bilateral agreements that we have with these other countries, none of those rises to the level of what we see in Section 224. Some of this for AUKUS, for example, that's primarily about cooperation on nuclear powered submarines that we're going to give to Australia, and we're going to co-produce some of that stuff, and make sure they get some of that very serious advanced technology. What Section 224 does is it says we're going to do that basically across every domain you can possibly think of, not just subs. We're going to do that across every sector, every defense sector, including the bill explicitly mentions AI, quantum, autonomous system, directed energy, cyber, biotech, so many more. And it goes on to talk about conventional weapon systems too. And so, if you can think of a major defense weapon system, or, something that's going to be on the battlefields of the future, this would enable the Israel and the U.S. to coordinate on it. It's just something we haven't seen before with these other agreements.
And how would this affect Israel's influence on U.S. politics and issues like military conflicts in the Middle East? Because much has been made of the Israel lobby. We've talked about that before. And, the various sort of boosters of pro-Israel sentiment. How would this entrench that even more?
Oh, yeah. I think it put all of that on steroids. I mean, you already see some of this playing out, and the thing about this provision is, some of this is already happening with the Israel U.S. military integration. We have co-production agreements with Israel already. We have co-production facilities in Arkansas and Mississippi, for example. And you see the members of Congress from those districts where those jobs are, they're some of the loudest cheerleaders for Israel. And that's kind of the way the military industrial complex system works, right? We know this. We talk about this. Bill Hartog and I talk about this in Trillion Dollar War Machine. That military contractors, they want to put jobs in as many districts as possible, because then they can use those jobs as political leverage. They can go to a congressional office and they can say, well, you might be thinking about voting against the F-35 because it's such a crappy program and it's wasting so much money. But, Congressman, the F-35 is responsible for 500 jobs in your district. It has a multi-million-dollar economic impact. So you can't vote against it. And that's by design for the F-35 program. And that's what we would get with this deal, but for Israel. When then Israel would then be able to come into the U.S., set up these co-production facilities, be able to legitimately claim that they were supplying jobs within the U.S., within states, within congressional districts. They would then operate effectively like a military contractor does in terms of their influence. All of that would be on top of the Israel lobby, everything we already know about it. So you're talking about an influence machine that I think would be really, really hard to stop, even harder than the Israel lobby is now.
Can we go back to you said that this would essentially make the US's military data, it would be Israel's military data too. I'm trying to wrap my head around what exactly that would mean. What would that entail, I guess, is what I want to ask.
That is a very good question, but I will say it's not. I'll preface right up front. It's not my claim that this would. It's in the bill itself. The bill itself literally uses the exact terms it uses are network integration within Israel and data fusion with Israel. Those are the exact terms in this. So this isn't some conspiracy theory that we're making up that the U.S. military and Israel's data would be fused. That's literally what it says in the statute here. I can tell you what my concerns about what that means. We would ultimately have to see, if this were enacted, we could see what would happen in practice. But as I read those terms, I see that as taking the gloves off, or taking any constraints off of any limits there might be on data sharing with Israel. And so, if you could go to, perhaps the worst case scenarios of a company like Palantir sharing all of their data with Israel. Some of our other, AI companies, are they going to be sharing their data with Israel? And this is a real problem too, because we've seen previously with Israel, we've worked so closely with Israel on many weapons programs, but it's often a one-way street. Just a few years ago, the U.S. was going to buy some Iron Dome, one of Israel's really prominent missile defense systems. We were going to buy a couple of those systems from Israel. But we canceled. It was $1 billion deal. We canceled the deal specifically because Israel wouldn't share data with us about those Iron Dome systems. And so we've already seen a pattern here that, when it comes to, data with Israel, it can be a one-way street. With this, then, calling for data fusion, I think my concern and concerns I've heard from a lot of other folks in and outside of the military with this is that it would lead to even more of a one-way street with the U.S. supplying Israel with all or a lot of its data, and Israel still keeping some of its data to itself.
What are some of the other? I know one of the questions I keep getting asked when talking about this article and the ramifications of it is, what are some of the concrete concerns for what could play out if this passes?
Yeah, I think the real nightmare kind of scenario here is that this goes forward and it goes, it passes the NDAA, it becomes law. And then a few years down the road, we've started to do all of this stuff with Israel. We're giving them all the data like we just talked about. We've started all this co-production. Israel becomes, embedded in all our major defense acquisition programs. They're already part of the F-35 program, but they start to become a major supplier for aircraft carriers, all of this drone technology, these autonomous systems, all these weapons of the future. Israel becomes a core component of it. And then Israel does something that we really, really hate. We really, really don't like, and we say enough's enough. Whether that's Israel starts, say, cooperating with China or Russia, and we're upset with that, or they keep starting these destabilizing, devastating wars in the Middle East. And the U.S. gets to the point then and says, enough's enough. We're ending this cooperation with Israel. The problem would be at that point that it would be so hard to disentangle our own military, our own systems, our own data processes from Israel that it would be a national security risk to the US. And this isn't conjecture. We've seen this happen in little microcosms on international supply chains in the military industrial complex before. And now I'll give you a recent example on this, JG. In the F-35 program, it has this global supply chain, suppliers all around the world producing thousands of parts for every F-35 that goes out is under, multiple countries' banners. One of those big suppliers was the government of Turkey. Then they made something around 1,000 different parts that went into every single F-35 that was out there. They were a valued partner until Turkey went out and purchased a Russian surface-to-air missile defense system. And the U.S. said, no way, we're not going to let you have both F-35s and this Russian system at the same time. So they said, you're out of the F-35 program. The fallout from that took years to resolve. Immediately, there was about a $500 million bill that came due because of that. And ultimately, it's caused the estimates vary between $5 million and $10 million per plane that has cost to replace the parts that Turkey was making. And it took months for some of those parts to get replaced, if not years on others. So it added delays to an already delayed and over cost F-35 program. So now take that example and multiply it across all of these different weapon systems that Israel could be involved in. Again, could be drones, could be autonomous weapons, could be cyber technology. If we try to pull Israel out of all of those things at the same time, you're going to create an enormous national security vulnerability for the U.S. military. And I actually think, it's that scenario that policymakers should be thinking about. And, as they're going to sign off on this, they should be thinking about what's the worst case that could happen with this. And I think it's that, which is a serious threat to U.S. national security.
It's interesting because when talking with this about this with other people, I've had people say, so this would make the trajectory of the US Israel relationship as it stands now almost like irreversible. And I hate to go
Yeah.
that far with it, but it would deeply entrench the relationship's current trajectory.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right, JG. You and your if that's you and your friend's assessment, I think that's spot on. And it almost locks you in because all those costs that I just mentioned there, the cost of untangling it, this is not a light switch. You can't turn this thing on and off. This is a connection like no other. And one colleague say, this is kind of like getting pregnant. Once you have this, this is suddenly like you guys are bound for life, whether you hate each other or not. You're locked together with this defense integration baby that you've created. It's kind of a humorous metaphor, but there's a lot of truth to it. You really can't. The cost of unwinding this would be so high that the bar for Israel's misadventures would have to be even higher to make folks think about separating us from them. So, if that's true, then I think you'd see a situation where Israel's foreign policy would become the US's foreign policy and vice versa because of that integration.
Like I said, I hate to use that term irreversible, but it really would entrench it. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if it's not irreversible, it's darn near close. It would make it a lot costlier to reverse than it even is now.
Now, in analyzing this, should we be thinking about the time and the moment that this is coming up? Because this is coming at a time where more and more Americans are starting to question the traditional US support for Israel. Do you think that plays a role in why Section 224 is coming about now?
Yes, completely. I might have a lot of qualms with the way the Israel lobby operates in the U.S., but one thing I never say about them is that they're dumb. The Israel lobby in the U.S. is incredibly smart, savvy, and strategic. APAC and some of these other groups, Netanyahu, frankly, he's reading the tea leaves here, and he sees U.S. public opinion just plummeting when it comes to Israel. There was an Institute for Global Affairs poll that came out a couple weeks ago that really dug into this issue. I would encourage your listeners to check it out. And IGA found that by a more than 2-to-1 margin, people think that Israel is pursuing its interests and not the U.S. interest. And we just never seen this before, where the American public thinks by such a wide margin that Israeli interests are not U.S. interests anymore. And so the Israel lobby, Netanyahu, everybody is seeing that. So they want to take this connection that they have with the U.S. underground. they want to do this quietly. They don't want to have that military assistance vote, happening in Congress every year where the public can chime in. Aggrieved members of Congress can hold this up and bring up all the dirty deeds Israel has done. They'd much rather have all of this connection exist in that Byzantine Pentagon bureaucracy, where this can get hidden behind layers of paperwork, the defense acquisition system, which is already we know is broken. They want to get in there. They want to be a part of that because they know it has less visibility. They know it has less political accountability. So I have no doubt in my mind that this is a political play for them, designed to get around the will of the American people when it comes to Israel.
Can you talk a little bit about I believe the markup and vote for this for the 2027 NDAA is going to be on Thursday, correct? June 4th?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Thursday, June 4th.
Okay, so what are we hoping for right now? Is there a possibility that this Section 224 doesn't go through? For people that are
Yeah.
uninitiated, how would this work?
Yeah. It's a good question, and I'll try not to nerd out too much for your listeners here. But basically, where we're at, the NDAA is the defense policy bill, and we're at the very beginning of this process. And so, what we've got, where we found this, was in what's called the chairman's mark. And so, the chairman of the committee puts forth this bill, and then we're going to this markup, which is basically an opportunity for everybody else who's on the committee, Republicans, Democrats, everyone, to introduce amendments related to that. And they're going to go through this amendment process, and then they're going to come out of that. Some amendments will get added, some won't, and then you'll come out with a final bill that they're going to vote on. And they're going to pass that through the committee, and then it goes from that committee to it will ultimately be voted on by the entire House. There'll be called a floor vote. The Senate's going to go through the same thing in the next couple weeks here too. So you're going to see these parallel tracks going on there. So what's happening this Thursday in the House, it's the first opportunity to get rid of this thing. Where you're going to have to get rid of it at multiple points in this process because the Senate is very likely going to have this provision too. You're going to have to get it out of there. And then when the House and the Senate are resolving these two bills together in what's called a conference committee, you're going to have to make sure that some of these sneaky lobbyists don't sneak it in at that point too. So it's going to be a battle for the next 6 months. But the first big fight is coming this Thursday. And we've already heard Ro Khanna, he tweeted in response to Massey and to my article saying he's already committed publicly to introducing an amendment to strip this out in this Thursday. So I'd encourage everybody, call your member of Congress if they're on the House Armed Services Committee. Tell them how you feel about this. Tell them to support Ro Khanna's amendment to strip this out of there. If his amendment succeeds, then we've won the first battle. If it doesn't, we're still going to keep fighting. We got a lot of fights ahead of us, JG.
So so that amendment would basically stop it in its tracks. This
It,
section. Okay.
it would stop it in its tracks in the House version. It wouldn't stop the Senate from putting it in their bill. We'd have to then go over to the Senate and do the same fight in the Senate. And then the tricky thing, this is why government is so is so tricky, and you always got to keep an eye on it. Even if it gets stripped out of both the House and the Senate, APAC's lobbyists or some other lobbyists who like this bill, they could try and sneak it into the conference committee report. When both of these bills come together, they could still sneak it into that final version there. So this realistically means we're going to have to be fighting this for a few months. But the first step is this Thursday.
Now, what if things don't pan out the way you or I would like it to pan out on Thursday? Then what?
We're gonna try as much as possible to then rally the troops and head for the next fight. If we can keep it out, even if it does pass out of the House Armed Services Committee, which it might. At the end of the day, the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee is loaded with folks who have taken a lot of money from the Israel lobby, and so if their campaign coffers are any indication, there's a chance that they might shoot down any move to strip this out of the NDAA. That's very possible. But if we don't succeed Thursday, we are going to take the fight to the House. There's a lot of I'm not an advocacy person. I'm a research nerd. So I research the NDAA. So I'm not part of that process so much, but I know there's a lot of groups that will then switch their attention to the Senate and then ultimately to that conference committee.
So it's not over on Thursday, in other
It's
words.
not over, but
Okay. Because
we could get a big win. I mean, the expectation is, I think around town, the expectation is like at the end of the day, we're going up against the Israel lobby. We're going up against like arguably the most influential special interest group in the country. So the odds are stacked against you. This is this is like trying to fight Mike Tyson, but as we know from Mike Tyson, he got beat. He's beatable. They might be big and strong, but we got a puncher's chance here.
yeah, it's interesting. Another way to put all of this is that, you know, traditionally the pro-Israel lobby has worked through campaign contributions, media influence, and someone said this is more sophisticated than that. It's working
Yeah,
through the defense procurement bureaucracy itself, creating material interests that guarantee political support regardless of public opinion.
exactly. Exactly right. Yeah. I mean, and that's why like it really it bakes in the influence. Like the influence, it doesn't the influence wouldn't have to be bought anymore. The influence would be inherent in our system. It would be inherent in our national security. It would be inherent in the US military. And that's why, again, unraveling that would be so challenging, and it would effectively give the Israeli government carte blanche to do basically whatever they wanted in the Middle East, and then just fully assume that the U.S. always had their back.
Now, are there any other concerns that I haven't touched on yet that you think are worth bringing up, or anything that I've missed in regards to all of this?
Man, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, I think it can't be understated just how enormous the gap is between what most Americans want when it comes to the U.S. Israel relationship in what would happen in this proposal. This proposal, I think, inarguably would tie the U.S. and Israel together more than they ever have been before. Um, at a time when the American public is questioning the U.S. Israel relationship more than it ever has before. And that to me is what's so troubling right now. Like if this proposal had been introduced with a staunch U.S. ally, somebody that had always stood by our side, I would say like a United Kingdom. If this had been proposed in the way that AUKUS was, nobody really blinked an eye at AUKUS, the U.S. Israel UK partnership, because we looked at the UK and Australia as very trustworthy, reliable, not volatile partners. That was a very different thing. So you didn't have the uproar that you have with this. And so I just think it's just telling to me that Congress is willing to do this despite the will of the American people. This is ultimately like the name of the program that I run at the Quincy Institute is called Democratizing Foreign Policy. And basically what that means is we want to take foreign policy away from special interests like the Israel lobby and give it back to the American people. We'd love to see a foreign policy that benefits the American people, that's truly democratized. And the American people right now are saying they want less connection with Israel, and this policy, driven by special interests, is doing the opposite. I think that's why we're fighting this as much as we are.
Now, can you talk a little bit about Steve Simon's analysis? Because, I had a listener ask me about Steve Simon's briefing that he did for Quincy, and
Yeah.
they said to me that it was a little bit, I mean, it wasn't for me, but I guess for some folks it was a bit jargony. As in, he talks about how this would harm the political and diplomatic oversight mechanisms that make the relationship publicly accountable. And then he talks about how we'd be moving away from a visible aid vote into the opaque machinery of defense acquisition. And I know I had one listener ask what that meant. This like what does that mean, the machinery of defense acquisition?
Right, right, right. I will say, for Steve, this is why I love working at the Quincy Institute. You have guys like Steve. He worked in the Clinton White House. He's literally been doing this stuff for decades. He worked on.
And his work is speaking to policymakers and people that need to know about these things. Yeah.
Right, right. He has got the technical
Right. And I
expertise.
don't blame him for using that language. I hope everyone knows that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, and no, nor I. I mean, his technical expertise on this issue is second to none, and he is writing with that technical expertise in mind, and he's writing briefs like he did, for people like like that, and I'm writing responsible statecraft articles based on his work and some of this for folks like you and folks like your listeners. We're trying to. This is what Quincy Institute does. We have both that incredible inside deep knowledge, that research, and we have folks who are writing for responsible statecraft and trying to take that deep research and convey that to an audience, to a mainstream audience, and that's what I think really the 1-2 punch that Steve and I tried to do here. But one other thing about Steve, I'll say with that, his brief, it was prophetic. Steve saw this coming. Steve is effectively like the Miss Cleo on this, just predicting the future. He saw this coming down the tracks months ago. He saw that this is where Israel was heading, and he saw the reasons for it. Everything we talked about, public opinion souring against them. So they wanted to move this behind the scenes. They wanted to do this a little more quietly. And that's why Steve wrote this. He started writing this brief a while ago, needless to say, well before this came out. And so it was just a sort of fantastic coincidence that Steve's brief came out last Tuesday, literally just hours before the NDAA came out with this Section 224 amendment. That was basically everything Steve said. Steve's nightmare about what would happen, as he laid out in that brief, was Section 224. And so, Steve, I give Steve all the credit in the world. He had the foresight to see this coming, and he warned us about it in advance. And that's what made my Responsible Statecraft article possible. And that's what made all of this pushback possible. So kudos to Steve for starting us all on this path.
So I guess what I meant when I mentioned the that line about the opaque machinery of defense acquisition, yeah, it sort of seems to me that that ties into the U.S. Department of Defense and also the purchasing of weapons technology and services from private contractors. So I was wondering, how does this all tie into the broader military industrial complex?
Yeah, yeah. What Steve's really talking about there is kind of what we were talking about before, is the Pentagon bureaucracy. It is a Byzantine system. It is an enormous system. It's clunky, and so much of what happened is shielded from the public's eyes. So you can't get in there and get into the mind of an acquisitions person. You can't know what's going through their head. You can't read every single line item on a contract that's signed between Israel and the U.S., or a private Israeli firm and a private U.S. firm, for example, who enter into one of these licensing co-production agreements. You can get some of that information from it, but you don't have anywhere near the level of transparency that you do under the current aid model. And so that's Steve's concern there, is that this is moving from what, as the aid model with Israel has many flaws, as many people have pointed out. But this new system has even less transparency and even more ways for Israel to exert influence over the U.S.
So before closing out, is there anything else you want to uh, touch upon with my listeners? And what can they really do? Should they be calling their congressman at this point?
Yeah. I think they should because here's what I would tee up for your listeners and what a plea to your listeners here is that we got multiple bites at the apple. The first one I mentioned is this Thursday, so take a look see if you're a member of Congress, your representative in the House, if they're on the Armed Services Committee. Call them, write a letter. We've seen across the country, we've seen letters to the editor in local newspapers calling out their member of Congress to vote against this provision. Do it. Start to do that. Let your members know, however you can, that you're not okay with them voting for Section 224. If your member's not on the House Armed Services Committee, go ahead and call them anyways, because our next step in the fight in this is, as I mentioned, it'll go to the floor. Get that floor vote, and we've already got confirmed from Thomas Massie that if Ro Khanna's amendment in HASC is not successful, Thomas Massie has publicly confirmed that he is going to introduce an amendment to the full House to strip this out there. So there's going to be an opportunity for every single member of Congress, both House and Senate, will get a chance to vote on this. So, if anything I've said today scares you, dear listener, contact your member of Congress and help to join the fight so we can stop this before it starts.
And again, I guess the other important aspect is like people don't have to get doom and gloom immediately, right? Because, like you
No,
said, it's a committee
no,
vote first, and then it'll move to the full House floor for consideration. So this is going to be a little bit more drawn out.
yeah. It's going to be a long fight, but I think it's important for us. You got to recognize that, AIPAC's not turning away from this issue. They're not going to get tired. The other folks in the Israel lobby, Netanyahu is certainly not going to get tired of trying to push this through. Israel wants this, and pro-Israel lobby in the U.S. they want this very badly. They're not going to stop fighting for it. They're not going to take any time off in pushing for this. And so those of us opposing it, we have to do the same. And we have to have that same sense of urgency and recognize the danger that this poses for the U.S. and for U.S. national security.
Last thing, other than the sort of usual suspects of, and I mean that in the best way possible, Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna, do you see anyone else potentially taking this up? I know you mentioned in the article that you had Senator Chris Van Hollen sort of writing in the New York Times recently that,
Right.
the support of, the Israeli government is maybe too reflexive. Do you think we're going to see more people than expected potentially joining Massey and Ro Khanna on this?
Yes, I think, I think there is a space now, because of that public opinion, because of where the public's at on this, where members of Congress feel free to question the U.S.'s ties to Netanyahu's government more than they ever have before. And that's going to translate to more members of Congress coming out against this. And I think they're going to be freed up more than they would have been. If this happened 3 years ago, I'd have been honest with you. I'd have thought that, we didn't have a chance, JG. But I think now we do have a chance. And I think this vote on Thursday at the markup, I think it's going to surprise folks. Even if we don't, if we don't win, even if the 224 doesn't get stripped outright, I think it's going to surprise a lot of folks how many people on HASC do vote to strip this out. And then that sends a message going forward. That sends a message to the Senate Armed Services Committee. That sends a message to all of Congress that you've got the space to vote against this. You've got the space to do what's right, to put America first, not Israel first.
And again, there is a fight even after this section, regardless of whether it's rejected or not. Just because I've had
Yeah.
listeners say, "Well, if things pass on Thursday, is that the end?" And you're saying, "No, it's not."
No. I would encourage your listeners to think about this, more like a playoff series. And the NBA playoffs start on Wednesday, and so think of this as a 7 game series. If we win game one on Thursday, that's awesome. But it's a 7 game series. We might lose some parts of this, but ultimately it's going to be a prolonged fight, and we have to keep fighting because we know the other side's going to.
Real quick, if you could, let my listeners know how they can keep up with your work, and also can you plug the $1 Trillion War Machine book?
Oh man, thanks so much. Yeah, you can find me on X. That's my main social media platform. I'm at Ben Freeman DC. That's BenFreeman DC. My latest tweet, where you can see on this article, garnered over 1.2 million views now. So please keep pumping it, everybody. It's got a big thread on this whole issue, so you can kind of get the details there and get a link to the Responsible Statecraft article. Speaking of responsible statecraft, that is my main publication outlet. You can check it out at responsiblestatecraft.org. That is the online magazine of the Quincy Institute, headed up by the always inspiring Kelly Vlahos. And then the $1 Trillion War Machine. Go buy it everywhere books are sold. We got an audio book now. We got ebooks. It got translated into Korean recently too. So for your Korean listeners, we've got you covered too. That book was another passion project for my wonderful co-author Bill Hartung and I. And we certainly think that it lays bare the military-industrial complex more comprehensively than any book we had seen, which is really why we wrote it. So if you want to get an understanding for how the military-industrial complex in the U.S. works, that's the book to buy right there.
Thanks again, Benjamin Freeman, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thanks so much, JG. Take care.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. If nothing else, if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.